unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal, to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil-producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy-consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden their cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them, but the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence. They have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased by from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine, and may God protect our troops.
Mr. President.
Associated Press, Zeke.
So do you have any plans to speak with President Putin at this point, and what interactions have you had with the Russian government?
I heard the first part. Do I have any plans to speak with Putin at this point, and what?
What communications have you had with the Kremlin as far as military operations in Ukraine and making sure this does not spiral into a larger conflict?
Well, it's a large conflict already. The way we're going to ensure it's not going to aspire to a larger conflict is by providing all the forces needed in the Eastern European nations that are members of NATO. NATO is more united than it's ever been, and I have no plans to talk with Putin. Wall Street Journal, Tarina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be a part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks have of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take. Cecilia Vega, ABC.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time. And we have to show resolve so he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur. He's going to say, oh, my God, these sanctions are coming. I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together. And we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Will he go beyond Ukraine, sir? Do you see him going beyond?
Yes.
Thank you. Two topics, just really quick. First, markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond, and markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely as long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period. What's the next question? I'm sorry.
The next question is, did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did in the summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, he was, I made it clear, as an adversary, and I said he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's written. Did you read the, I shouldn't, I'm not being a wise guy. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour's worth of speeches, why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
You're confident that these devastating sanctions are going to be as devastating as Russian missiles and bullets and tanks?
Yes, Russian bullets, missiles, and tanks in Ukraine. Yes, I am.
Thank you, President Biden. If sanctions cannot stop President Putin, what penalty can?
I didn't say sanctions couldn't stop him.
You've been talking about the threat of these sanctions for several weeks now.
Yes, but the threat of the sanctions and imposing the sanctions and seeing the effect of the sanctions are two different things. They're two different things. And we're now he's going to begin to see the effect of the sanctions.
And what will that do? How will that change his mindset here, given he's
Because
attacking
it will so
Ukraine as we
weaken his
speak?
country that he'll have to make a very, very difficult choice as to whether to continue to move toward being a second-rate power or, in fact, respond.
You said in recent weeks that big nations cannot bluff when it comes to something like this. You recently said that the idea of personally sanctioning President Putin was on the table. Is that a step that you're prepared to take? And if
It's
not,
not a bluff, it's on the table.
sanctioning President Putin?
Yes.
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President?
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President, if I can, you detailed some severe and swift new sanctions today and said the impact it will have over time. But given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Yes.
Can I ask you about Zelensky? Sir, you spoke to Vladimir Zelensky yesterday, sir?
What's the risk that we are watching the beginning of another Cold War, and is there now a complete rupture in U.S. and Russian relations?
There is a complete rupture right now in U.S.-Russian relations if they continue on this path that they're on. And in terms of a Cold War, that depends. You have the vast majority of the rest of the world in total opposition to what he's doing, from Asia to South America to Europe to around the world. And so it's going to be a cold day for Russia. The idea, you don't see a whole lot of people coming to his defense.
And are you, if I could follow up, sir, are you urging China to help isolate Russia? Are you urging China to help isolate Russia?
I'm not prepared to comment on that at the moment. No. Yeah. No. He's had his hand up a long time.
Thank you, Mr. President. How concerned are you that Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine into other countries, and the U.S. will have to get involved if he moves into NATO countries?
Well, if he did move into NATO countries, he will be involved. We will be involved. The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened. If we don't move against him now with these significant sanctions, he will be emboldened. And look, you know, well, anyway.
And can you talk anything more about your conversation? Mr. President.
Why not sanction Putin directly today?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
So India, which is a major defense partner of the United States, is India fully with you on the issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Does the Defense Department of the United States?
So India is one of your major defense partners. Is India fully in sync with the United States on Russia?
We're in consultation with India today. We haven't resolved that completely.
One more question.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
President Biden in the East Room talking about the military action, the invasion underway from Russia into Ukraine there. The president saying this is a dangerous moment for all of Europe and going on to say, but the entire world now sees what Putin is all about. naked aggression, saying Putin desires an empire. He wants to put the Soviet Union back together, in so many words, the president said. He outlined a series of sanctions against additional banks, including Russia's largest bank. He said every asset Russia has access to in America is now closed off. He believes the actions taken today will cut off imports into Russia by at least half. He also reiterated what the White House, what the president has said now for many, many days, that our forces are not in the region to engage with Russia in Ukraine or otherwise, though he was pressed just moments ago that if Putin continues on this march and goes into any NATO countries, the president conceded if he moves into NATO countries, well, then we will be involved. But obviously, we are far from that at the moment. Let's bring in our senior White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, you heard several reporters there at the White House, including our own Cecilia Vega, asking about the power of these sanctions. Are they working? Are they enough? And whether or not this White House, this president, is prepared to sanction Vladimir Putin directly.
Yeah, it is clear he is still leaving that on the table, but Biden sending a very clear message that this is Vladimir Putin's war and that Putin now will pay the price, announcing these harsh new sanctions, including what he described as being the most impactful, the most painful, going after these major Russian banks. And he again reiterated that this is a unified response. We know he's been in constant communication with NATO leaders, with the G7 leaders just earlier today in a virtual meeting here at the White House, saying if Putin's intent was to somehow see the West splinter in reaction to this, that he's seeing, in fact, the exact opposite. Putin is trying to test the resolve of the West, and the West is united. And telling our Cecilia Vega that, these sanctions aren't intended to prevent Putin, but really to inflict pain on him so that the Russian people can see the impact of Putin's actions here. And while he is leaving something on the table, those sanctions against Putin himself, he also made clear what is not on the table, reiterating again that there will be no U.S. troops going into Ukraine, because he has warned over and over again that that would spark another world war, David.
You heard Mary, the president asked there, has there been a complete rupture of a U.S.-Russian relations? He said, absolutely, there has been a rupture of our relationship with Russia, given what's playing out, what Putin has decided to do in the global stage. He said, we'll see what happens in the future when it comes to the relationship between the two countries. He was asked whether or not this is the beginning of another Cold War. He said it will be a cold day, certainly for Russia, given the sanctions that have been imposed and the unity that the president says he comes to the table with as far as sanctions are concerned against Russia. He said NATO stands united, and this is a point that the White House has made several times in recent days, that this is perhaps the strongest we've seen NATO in many, many years, the relationship. I want to bring in our senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, on the ground in Ukraine. Ian, we were on the air late last night when, in the middle of the night, Moscow time, Vladimir Putin told the Russian people this was a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine. And now, less than 24 hours later, we're watching an assault from multiple directions there in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right, David. I mean, the situation on the ground is serious, and it's growing more serious, really, by the hour. I think what we've now seen is this concerted three-pronged attack from the south, from the northeast, and from due north of the capital, Kiev. Russian special forces have taken this airfield, which is just around 20 miles north of the capital here. There's been ongoing battles with Ukrainian forces. They appear now to be in control of that. In Chernobyl, which is about 65 miles also due north of the capital, Kiev, again, Russian forces appear in control there. Heavy fighting is taking place in Kharkiv in the northeast, and also down towards Crimea in the south. Again, Russian forces seem to have overwhelmed Ukrainian defenses in one of the first key towns on Ukrainian soil. And what it looks like is an attempt to try and encircle Kiev, and the situation in the capital is looking increasingly dire.
And, of course, the question, Ian, the world has right now in watching these forces encircle Kyiv, as you've just pointed out, does this, in fact, mean that Vladimir Putin wants a change in government there?
Yeah, I think really the attempt here seems to be to try and decapitate the government. We know that the Biden administration tried to urge President Zelensky to leave. That was something he didn't want to do. He has tried to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people who've really been tested today. We met one, she's a news anchor, morning news anchor, who we'd interviewed a couple of weeks ago. They were preparing for the worst. Her husband had volunteered for the civil defense. Today, he had to go off to the front line. They had to take their 3 children on their own to a hotel in the west of the country where they've been checked into that hotel, left on their own. He's gone back and gone to the front lines. She's now on her own in an apartment wondering what does she do if Russian forces come in. So real difficult choices that ordinary Ukrainians are having to make. But the reality is it looks like an attempt to decapitate the military and take out the Ukrainian government.
One last quick question before I let you go there, Ian. You mentioned it there, and it's a breaking headline while we were on the air, a confirmation of the Chernobyl zone, the so-called exclusion zone. You mentioned there that Russian forces now have control of that, and we should remind our audience, after years, obviously, of reporting on Chernobyl, that this is still a very dangerous site.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a very high-risk area. It is known as an exclusion zone, and the Ukrainian government have conceded that they've lost control of that area, but also said they can't guarantee the safety of that Chernobyl site, which is still very much active and dangerous, even though it's effectively capped. One imagines that's another bridgehead towards the capital, Kiev, but we have to wait and see. The ball is entirely in Vladimir Putin's court. There is military resistance taking place by the Ukrainians, but what we're seeing here is overwhelming power in the hands of the Kremlin and its forces on the ground.
All right, just extraordinary reporting from Ian Pannell and our team inside Ukraine. Ian, thank you. We know a state of emergency in effect in Ukraine, a curfew in effect. President Zelensky urging anyone in the country who can take up arms to do so and fight for independence, to protect their sovereign nation from attack from the Russians. I do want to check in with James Longman, who is based in Moscow, for us during this escalation. And James, you and I were talking just before we came on the air that there have been a number of Russians in the streets actually protesting Vladimir Putin's actions here, but they've been swiftly taken off the streets.
Yeah, that's right, David. Hundreds actually came out here in downtown Moscow to protest against the decision to invade Ukraine. And you can see riot police here, because that is the response you're met with if you protest in Vladimir Putin's Russia. You can see them in blue here. And we have been watching. And in fact, during those comments by President Biden, at least 3 people ripped off the street, arrested, taken away. Over 1,200 now arrests across Russia against this decision. Look, a lot of young people feel very passionately this is not the man they feel represents them. But the reality is a great majority, really, of Russians read and watch so much state media that they are believing the messages that they're being told about the threat that Ukraine poses. But here tonight in Moscow, a lot of real feeling about the anger that this decision has provoked in them.
Right,
David?
James Longman in Moscow on the protesters who dared to go in the streets, protest Putin's actions, but then were arrested, taken off the streets. That's the picture there. Of course, the picture inside Ukraine, the fear that Ian Pannell described, and many Ukrainians asking, what is the end game here? What does Putin really want? We should mention the markets here in this country down more than 500 points at this hour. We continue to watch the immediate global economic impact of Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com, and of course, I'll be back with the entire team for World News Tonight. If there are major developments before then, we'll be back on the air. I'm David Muir in New York. Good day.
This is an ABC News Live special report. The Ukraine-Russia crisis.
And our thanks to David Muir, and I'm Kira Phillips. Our continuing coverage continues now on Russia's attack of Ukraine. We just heard from President Biden as he addressed the nation. And what we can tell you now, that Russian troops have reportedly taken full control of the area around the Chernobyl nuclear power station, including the plant itself. That site just about 60 miles from Kyiv. These are live pictures from Kyiv Thursday morning. You could actually hear the shelling there in this video when our photographer captured these scenes there under the lights. Joining us now with the very latest is ABC's Phil Lipoff. He's actually in Poland. We also have with us White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks and ABC News Elizabeth Schulze also. But first, let's start with Ian Pannell, who is in Kiev after just listening to the president speak. Ian, can you just bring us up to date on what you are seeing, hearing, and what you know right now there straight from Kyiv?
Yeah, hi there, Kira. I mean, interestingly, the video that you were talking about there was shot by my cameraman here, James Gillings, and that really was the mood here. Suddenly we went from Vladimir Putin speaking to the sound of explosions ringing out across the capital, Kiev, and it's been an increasingly tense day. We have seen Russian forces start to move in from three distinct directions, really, in the northeast, up on the eastern border to near Russia, around Kharkiv. Heavy fighting taking place there. We've seen fighting to the south, just over the Crimean Peninsula. This was the peninsula that was annexed by Russian forces back in 2014. Fighting taking place there. But I think most worrying for the capital, Kiev, is this fighting that's been taking place at the Antonov airfield, which is only about 20 miles in that direction. We were seeing explosions in that direction last night. Not possible to say whether it was at that airfield, but we know that Russian special forces landed. There were videos of helicopters flying into that area. They were engaged by Ukrainian forces. It now appears that the airfield has been secured by those Russian troops. Russian troops also moving into Chernobyl. Of course, people will know Chernobyl from the nuclear disaster that happened there in the 1980s, but there is a protected area there. Russian troops have moved in and seem to control that. What that means is that Russian forces are now about 65 miles or so outside of Kiev, up by Chernobyl. But most worryingly, this airfield here is only 20 miles away from the center of the city. What this looks like is an attempt to effectively decapitate the Ukrainian military, render it ineffective, but also to take on the Ukrainian government in an effort to potentially try and encircle the capital. We've seen hundreds, potentially thousands of people leave Kiev today, heading westwards. Also people coming from the east of the country in this direction. Things have changed dramatically in 24 hours, and the situation tonight in the capital looks increasingly desperate.
So, Ian, with those that have not been able to leave, what more can you tell us about this major curfew that has been imposed? Also, we are reading that the metro stations there are turning into bomb shelters. Can you give us more for a feel of what Ukrainians are going through there in Kyiv that have not been able to leave?
Yeah, and that is the vast majority. It's a good question. The streets have been eerily quiet today. Most of the shops, most of the stores have been closed. The supermarkets that were open had lines of people going in there, stocking up on supplies. This is something that we hadn't seen in the previous few weeks, despite all the warnings. ATM machines had long lines of people. As you say, some of the metro stations, which are very deep underground, were being used as bomb shelters. But I think this is a very terrifying and lonely time for a lot of Ukrainians. We just met up with a woman called Mariska Podolko. She's a famous morning news anchor here in Ukraine. We'd interviewed with her for ABC News a few weeks back. We'd stayed in contact with her. Her husband, who's a former MP, had signed up with the civilian defense forces. We saw him in training. He didn't even have a real gun at that point, just a wooden silhouette of a gun. Well, today, he's now gone effectively to the army. He's left his wife. Their children have been dropped off at a hotel on their own in western Ukraine for their own safety, while she tries to get her elderly parents together and decides what to do. She sat in a flat just with her cat, alone and afraid and not knowing what to do. They all believed they'd have more time. They all believed that this would never happen. Nobody could have imagined quite how devastating a moment this would be for the country and for the individuals. And that's what everyone's having to go through right now. It's hard to comprehend. You know, the Ukrainians are like us. They live their lives in a very similar way. They have similar aspirations. And they, like us, would never have imagined that such a day would come to pass. And yet that is the reality. It's a very lonely prospect. Yes, the rest of the world may condemn what's happening, but they know that this fight is theirs and theirs alone.
It is quite a tale of two countries. Ian Panel there in Kyiv for us with a feel for how the people, the Ukrainians, are responding to this invasion. From there, we go to Moscow, where our James Longman is there on the streets. He, too, has had a chance to talk to the people there. James, I understand you've been a part of witnessing protests. Tell us what the response has been, not only to the President of the United States and his speech that he gave just moments ago, but what things have been like since we talked yesterday.
Well, we heard that there were protests down on the street here in central Moscow, and we felt we had to come down and see. There were hundreds of people actually on the street. It's calmed down a bit now, but you can see this is the response you get in Vladimir Putin's Russia if you decide to come out and protest the decision he's made. Riot police, these are the men in blue here, and they have been steadily picking people off the street, arresting them. I was listening to President Biden's comments there. Whilst he was speaking, 3 or 4 people were arrested at the time. One was just street taken away. That is what happens here. Now, there haven't been protests like this really since the arrest of Alexei Navalny over a year ago, and so it really is quite something to watch people come down into the street here. They are mostly young people. I had 2 young girls, actually. There's 2 students who ran up to us, literally. She said to me, "What news organization are you from?" I said, "ABC News." She said, "ABC News, really? Let me speak to you." I've never had that before, and it was absolutely extraordinary because she felt so overwhelmed that she had the chance to say how she felt about something, and she said that Vladimir Putin does not represent her, and she felt very strongly that she wanted to make that known. But there's a sense really among young people here that they don't really have a leadership for their opposition here, because obviously in Vladimir Putin's Russia, you are arrested and imprisoned if you show that you disagree with him or if you show any opposition to him. So really it's an opposition movement which is leaderless. But they came down here, they said they were chanting no to war, and they wanted to have their feelings heard. And I spoke to another woman who was very moving. I said, "What do you want to say to the people of Ukraine?" And she looked at the camera and she just said, "We're praying for your women and children." Because there is a realization among a certain quarter of Russian society that what Vladimir Putin has done is awful as far as they're concerned. I should say that this is not the majority necessarily in Russia. There are many different Russias. We're in Moscow, a cosmopolitan city. There will be many Russians across the country who do believe in what Vladimir Putin has been saying, and that's for one very clear reason, which is that it's a very heavily controlled media space here. We had an announcement yesterday by the kind of media watchdog, it's essentially a censorship agency, telling media outlets here that they must use, quote unquote, official Russian sources to report on the news from Ukraine. And if they don't, they get fined. $80,000 is the fine, because they're talking about this as being a military operation. They won't use the word invasion. You won't see that word used on any Russian state media, because they have to walk a very fine line. Ukraine is not some distant foreign nation. They are brothers and sisters to Russian people. They are, in many cases, cousins. They're relations. They share a shared history, a shared culture. And Vladimir Putin knows that. So they've been very, very clear about the narrative here. This is not about attacking civilians. They've said that. They said it's only about hitting military installations, and it certainly isn't an invasion. Now, people here in Russia will be left to kind of come to their own conclusions about that. But certainly these young people on the street here in Moscow, they don't believe a word of it. Kira?
James Longman in Moscow. James, thank you so much. Appreciate your perspective. So from Ukraine to Russia to now here in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., where we heard President Biden today outline these strong sanctions and economic consequences that Russia will now face because of Putin's choice to invade. Take a listen from his speech moments ago.
Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It'll strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions.
Mary Ellis, you look at James Longman standing on the streets of Moscow where life looks so normal behind him. And then you listen to what President Biden just outlined and these actions he has taken, these sanctions, and you wonder how quickly Russians will feel the impact of these sanctions, not only short term, but long term.
Yeah, Kira, President Biden said that these sanctions were designed to have an immediate impact as well as an impact over time. He laid out that the United States would be sanctioning 4 major banks in Russia, over $1 trillion in assets. He said every asset they have here in America will be frozen. But you're exactly right. There's a reason that President Biden faced incredible skepticism from reporters in the room who were asking, is it enough and how long will it take? I was very struck by the moment where President Biden said, come back to me in 30 days. in a month, he said, a month, asked me what effect these sanctions are having. Well, it's hard to imagine that anyone in Ukraine wants to wait a month for things to have an impact. I think that the United States, President Biden, the White House is going to be under a lot of pressure to pull out all the stops. We've already heard that from members of Congress. You know, Mitch McConnell, Leader McConnell today said that they need to have the most punishing sanctions available to them put in place right now. The White House is still facing a lot of questions as to why President Putin himself wasn't singled out and sanctioned individually. I think that they're going to continue to get that question, and they just right now don't have a good answer for it.
Well, the president also touting that NATO has never been more unified at this point, which takes us to Phil Lipoff there in Poland, where U.S. troops are helping at border checkpoints. What role are they playing at this point? What challenges are they facing as they do get ready, Phil, for possibly hundreds of thousands of refugees?
Well, Kira, it's already kind of begun. Our Matt Gutman was at the border today and reported that there is a family he spoke to that had been waiting in line 11 hours to get from Ukraine into Poland. And he said that line is going to get longer, up to 20 hours. And then who knows from there, because this is the worst case scenario in Ukraine. There are Ukrainians now needing to flee to Poland for help and for safety for their families. And as you mentioned, we have thousands of troops here, the 82nd Airborne Division. They are down on the border, and they are doing everything they can with Polish authorities trying to set up the border. There are 8 border crossings. If you look at the map, most of Poland's border is shared with Ukraine. Tiny portion of it up north with Russia, but that's not really in question right now. It's the stretch of the border where there are 8 border crossings where people are going to be coming over. There are many Ukrainians already living here in Lublin, where I am, and I spoke to many of them today. And Mary Alice makes a good point. The reporters in that room with President Biden were asking the question, the Ukrainians here in Poland asking the same question. Are sanctions enough? Why haven't you gone after Vladimir Putin himself? You put sanctions on time and time again, and look, he's taking Ukraine as we speak. And the Ukrainians who live there have family across the border in Ukraine, and they are desperately worried about them. I spoke with one young family who, just by fortune, came here last night to Lublin from Ukraine, from Lviv actually, to sleep here for the night because they were so concerned. They have a 1-year-old son, and so they thought they would spend the night here and then go back tomorrow, or today rather, and that is not the case. They now wake up today and say, maybe it'll be a day, maybe it'll be weeks, and then they see the further incursion and the surrounding of these cities in Ukraine, and they just don't know when they're going to go back, Kira.
And Elizabeth, what are you hearing from the Pentagon and the White House about the potential for this war in Ukraine to spread to other NATO allies? And are U.S. troops preparing for that? I mean, the president did just say if Putin moves into NATO countries, we will be involved.
Yeah, that's right, Kira. The president has made a very clear point to say that there will be no U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. But if this invasion spreads to NATO countries, that's a different story. We are getting a statement from a senior defense official who tells us that at the direction of the president, Defense Secretary Austin has now ordered the deployment of 7,000 additional troops from the U.S. to Germany. This is part of those 8,500 troops that have been placed on high alert. So this is a new set of troops that are now going to be sent to Europe, in addition to the existing ones that have been kind of reallocated to the eastern flank. So part of an effort to really shore up the NATO response there, which really has been the military message that President Biden has made in these public addresses, saying we are standing by our allies, that NATO has now activated its activation response plans, and that this is a very clear, coordinated effort that we are ready to accelerate if needed, but really still making that point that this is about shoring up the NATO presence versus bringing any American troops into the conflict in Ukraine right now.
Elizabeth, Mary Alice, James, Ian, Phil, all of you, thank you so much as we continue to follow all the latest on Russia and Ukraine. We're also talking about the ripple effects that this war in Ukraine will have on the global economy. Oil prices have already jumped to the highest levels in 8 years. Joining us now to talk about where it may be headed is energy expert and former member of the Ukrainian parliament, Svetlana Zalishchuk. She is now an advisor and CEO CEO of Nafagaz Group, and she joins me from Kyiv by phone. Svetlana, first of all, I want to ask you, as a Ukrainian there on the ground, how are you holding up? How have you and your family been? How have you been impacted by these unfolding attacks?
Yes, thank you for asking. So, you know, I live in the downtown of in Kyiv, and usually we wake up to the bells of this one of the oldest churches in this part of the world. But today we woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning because of the 8 super powerful blasts around the capital of my country. And, you know, it felt absolutely surreal because whoever has been ever to Ukraine or to Kyiv knows very well that it's a properly European capital. Nothing different than from, for example, Berlin or any other Eastern European country. And all of a sudden, we're in the middle of the proper, full-scale invasion. 4 people in Kyiv had to look at their children and think, okay, so what do we do now? So me personally, I was helping some journalists throughout the day with reporting. So I was not doing my job, but I went to one of the Ukrainian media and was trying to translate the reports into English so that the whole world can hear and see what's going on. But at the moment, I'm heading to the south, towards the south. I packed all my life kind of in a, you know, just a hand luggage suitcase. And I don't know where I'm going because I don't know whether I will have a chance actually to come back to my life, to my home, to my city. So I think that this is kind of the perspective that many people are facing at the moment because the road I'm driving, there are like thousands of people are driving in all of the directions out of Kyiv, out of their cities and towns, some either to the west, which is believed to be the most kind of safest place to go, or even abroad. But still, it's dangerous, it's surreal, and it's very uncertain. We don't know what to expect.
You know, you're a former member of the Ukrainian parliament. Do you think that President Zelensky needs to leave the country at this point? And if he did, what kind of message would that send to your people, many of whom don't want to leave and are taking shelter now in these bomb shelters down by the metro? I mean, you're driving the streets, you're seeing what's happening in real time. What do you think your president should do?
Well, President is doing what he can. He's communicating with his people every single hour. The main message is that the people shouldn't panic, you know, and should still should stay safe. But also there is a message to the men of my country to take as possible and to go and fight because it's a historic moment. But also, you know, the very important message is the message my president is sending to the whole world, and I want to just reiterate it and highlight it, that this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is not a blow on Ukrainians. This is a blow on a human dignity, on a human life, on a human values, you know, and I think the responsibility to act to this situation has to be based not on the principle of NATO membership, but on the basis of the moral ground. I met President Biden personally when he was in Kyiv in 2017. He was the vice president at that time. And he had a meeting with these young parliamentarians, including me. I had the privilege to meet him. And he was talking about democracy and about the perspective of Euro-Atlantic integration and European integration between our countries. You know, now I think up to the whole world to stand against the dictator, which, by the way, I believe we allowed because of our ignorance, because of our responsibility, because of our sometimes arrogance, or I don't know, maybe naivety sometimes. We helped Putin to do what he's doing now. We pumped up his budget with the gas money, with the oil money. We tolerated for a long time his oligarchs stealing money from Russian taxpayers and enjoying themselves in a luxury capitals in the European Union. That should have been cancelled and banned yet in 2008 when Putin invaded Georgia, or at least 2014 when Putin already invaded and annexed Crimea and Donbass. So I think that the answer at the moment is not enough. I've heard that President Biden said that maybe you should come back with an answer of how sanctions will impact Putin in 1 month. In 1 month, many people will not exist anymore. Many people will not live. Today we have been witnessing of how small children are dying, of how civilians are just shelled in the center of their cities. This is surreal. This is a proper world war in my mind, and this is how it should be treated.
Svetlana, final question. As a foreign policy advisor there in Ukraine, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Western leaders are limited in what kind of support they can provide you and your people. Do you feel that our country is doing enough? And what do you think it will take for President Putin to back off?
First of all, I don't think it has been done enough because, for example, Germany offered us in the preparation to this aggression. Everyone knew that Putin is going to invade. Everyone has been talking already for months, and Germany offered us 5,000 helmets. 5,000 helmets to protect ourselves from one of the strongest army in the world, right? So I think that many sanctions should have been enacted before, because that would given Putin a completely different calculation, not even from a military point of view, but from a point of view that his population, people around him, business and oligarchs, would be so angry and would probably show him that, hey, Putin, maybe we shouldn't do that because it will fire back on us as well. Now, it seems to me that it's a bit too late and too little to go with sanctions like that, because anyway, they're already in Kiev. They're in my city, they're in my home, and I think that strong answer, this is what it would have taken in order to prevent this war at all. Now, we are in the middle of this war. So I think that, for example, there is a discussion about SWIFT. I mean, what else Putin has to do in order for SWIFT to be enacted? Like, what on earth can more aggressive or more insane could be done to a peaceful country like Ukraine or any other country in the world, so that the strongest and most painful sanctions should be enacted to stop this war? That's like an open, a rhetoric question that I'm answering, I think.
Svetlana Selachuk, I appreciate you calling in there from the streets of Kyiv. Let's stay in close contact as the news continues to develop here out of Ukraine and Russia. We are joined by a number of various guests that are advising not only those there in Ukraine, as we heard from Svetlana, but here back in the States. Members like Ann Wagner, representing Missouri's 2nd Congressional District, is joining now with her take as she follows today's developments. Congresswoman, let's begin with you. You heard the president's speech. What stood out to you? What more do we need to do at this point? The president announcing additional sanctions, but clearly right now, Putin not paying any attention to them.
Well, we should have been doing much, much more, Kira, up to this point as a deterrent factor. Our hearts, first of all, and prayers and thoughts go out to the people of Ukraine. This is an unprovoked and unwarranted war, an invasion of their sovereign territory. And I put some blame on the United States and this administration for slow rolling these sanctions. They should have been crippling. They should have been all-encompassing. I don't know why we're trickling this out a little bit at a time. I'm pleased that we're going after the financial institutions in a larger level. The other day, it was just a pinprick. It was, 2 small banks. Now, at least he's up to $1 trillion. But what about the SWIFT system? The UK were the first to call for it today. We should be taking them off of their ability to transfer money and work within the financial realms, state to state and bank to bank. It's fine that he's visa blocking some more elites, but why not go after Putin and the entire Duma, which is his parliament, who went for this declaration of war? And while we really need to be going after Russia and sanctioning them is in a realm of oil and gas. You know, Russia is nothing but, and Putin, he's a KGB dictator who is nothing more than a gas station with a strong military. So I want to see financial, economic, and energy and oil sanctions that are crippling. They should have been used as a deterrent factor. They were not. And here we are with a full-on invasion of Ukraine. And your own reporting, Kira, said that, that he's 65 miles outside of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, 190,000 troops and forces and firepower surrounding from the Black Sea up the eastern coast and across Belarus. This didn't have to be. And I think we should have been taking much stronger actions now and as a deterrent factor prior to this.
So tell me at this point, then, what exactly you are doing. We know this is a bipartisan issue when it comes to sanctions. The President Biden has received support from both sides of the aisle. What are you going to do now to take a stake in this? You have just said what you thought should have been done. How are you moving forward as a member of Congress?
Well, we are going to continue to press for these full-on crippling and isolating sanctions against Russia. I think they should be pulled from the UN Security Council. I believe in due time that Putin should be charged with war crimes. And I do believe we must go to the heart of what keeps them alive, which is their oil and gas. And probably one of the most important things we can do, Kira, is this administration has got to make America energy independent again, whether that's with our pipelines, taking off all the limitations on drilling on federal lands and beyond, fracking. We can be energy independent, and we should be the ones that are providing Russia, the Ukraine and Western Europe with cleaner LNG. So we need American energy independence. We need stronger financial, economic, and oil and gas sanctions against Putin, and he must be isolated. We cannot slow roll these sanctions. They must be done now. They should have been done weeks and weeks ago. Joe Biden created this mess, and he allowed this through weakness. Our adversaries are watching. Kira, my biggest concerns are the weakness that the U.S. has shown will now lead to provocative movements in Iran with the Ayatollah, in China with President Xi, perhaps going after Taiwan, or more incursions in the South China Sea, North Korea with Kim Jong-un. He keeps shooting off rockets and being more provocative every day. Weakness begets weakness shows that our adversaries, that they have an opportunity to cause us harm potentially. So I'm very concerned about the world and the direction that we're going.
Congresswoman Ann Wagner, Republican from Missouri, appreciate your time today as we continue to follow this ongoing crisis. And as the world watches the escalating tension fueled by Russia, Ukraine is feeling support from around the globe. We'll hear from a young woman in Israel who showed up at a protest outside the Russian embassy in Tel Aviv.
My message to Russians is like, this is the time to stand up, to wake up, to go to protests. I know it could be scary, but this is the only thing you can do. And this is probably the only thing that will stop it.
Ukraine-Russia crisis will return in just a moment. Stay with us.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter.
Feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Now streaming on ABC News Live.
It's all about you.
The straightforward facts. ABC News is America's #1 news. Good Morning America, #1 in the morning, 9 years running. World News Tonight with David Muir, #1 in the evening with America's most watched newscast. 2020, the #1 news magazine on Friday nights. Nightline, #1 in late night versus the competition. The View, the #1 daytime talk show. And ABC News Live, #1 in streaming news. ABC News is America's #1 news. This is what being live is all about. This is ABC News Live.
All right, we're going to move back. Let's move back. We're surrounded by people squeezing into this bomb shelter.
We're on an urgent delivery run.
Not afraid to go there.
So my question, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Breaking news, live events.
This is the moment.
Streaming straight to you, anytime, anywhere.
You just met one friend right here.
You're watching ABC News Live. Thanks for streaming with us.
National parks are incredibly safe places, but crime will happen.
Hey, my wife has fallen. She's in really critical condition.
At that time, I thought it was just a tragic accident.
There's still a lot of questions we need to ask.
There were small things that didn't totally add up.
This is 2 lives for Harold that have died now.
I was shocked.
Something's not right.
I risked my life. I put my family in danger. If I was caught, they would have put a bullet in my head. But it was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do.
Terror plot foiled in Garden City, Kansas.
That would have been one of the most deadly acts of domestic terrorism ever in the United States.
It would have been Oklahoma City.
He put his family, himself in jeopardy for us.
They were a killing team.
A mother and daughter poisoning her family members.
I mean, this is unheard of. Who does that?
I knew they were drinking antifreeze.
What? Nobody just drinks antifreeze.
It's incredible.
She's never talked publicly until now. How is it that you could kill your own family?
There's more to that than what people know.
What is the truth, Diane?
The new 2020, Friday at 9/8 Central on ABC.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. You are watching our continuing coverage of the invasion of Ukraine. And as it intensifies, we want to bring in a former senior director for European Affairs on the National Security Council and fellow on the Council of Foreign Relations. Charles Kupchani joins us now with his insight into what the president had to say this past hour and also what's happening on the ground in Kyiv and also in Moscow. Charles, you served on Obama's National Security Council. You traveled with President Biden when he spoke to Ukraine's parliament in 2015. What do you think about what is happening right now as you listen to the president now in 2022 as an invasion has now begun into Ukraine on behalf of Vladimir Putin?
Well, what we're witnessing here is a second big bite at the apple. In 2014, the Ukrainian people rose up and they overthrew a pro-Russian regime. There was a democratic election. There was a president who wanted to take Ukraine toward the West, toward the European Union, toward NATO. And Russia came in and grabbed Crimea and fostered a separatist uprising in Donbass. What that did was unify the Ukrainian people behind their president. They wanted to move further toward Europe. Putin didn't like it. He's been getting more and more angry, and now he has leapt into the dark. He is trying to topple the regime in Kiev. That is going to happen. most likely, because the Russian military vastly is superior to the Ukrainian military. The big question in my mind is what comes after. Will he be able to keep hold of a country of 44 million angry Ukrainians who want nothing to do with Russia? Unwittingly, I think Putin is overreaching and could potentially be sowing the seeds of his own demise. It just may take some.
As our coverage continues clearly throughout the days, the evenings, the weeks, we will talk more, and we appreciate your insight, of course. And as the crisis does continue to unfold in Ukraine, there is one person who may know what happens next, and that's Russia's Vladimir Putin. The former KGB agent has now ruled Russia for more than 2 decades. But how did Vladimir Putin even get to where he is today, and what's driving his latest power moves? Byron Pitts has more.
Much the world continues to watch and wait and worry about what happens next in Ukraine. Putin's every move scrutinized. In Mother Russia, Putin's power remains absolute.
Hurrah!
If we talk about Putin's strategic goals, actually it's only one, and it's very simple, as for every dictator, is to stay in power forever.
Garry Kasparov, once the greatest chess player in the world, fled Russia in 2013, fearing retribution after criticizing Putin.
Putin's Russia is not a classical dictatorship because it has no ideology. It's more like a mafia state.
The modern-day czar has been in power unopposed since 1999, even altering constitutional term limits to allow him to run again in 2024.
Many Russians actually like the fact that he kind of shows to the West he's not a rug under the Western feet. And if you're not going to recognize us when we speak to you, at least you're going to be freaked out by what we do.
Nina Khrushcheva is the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, a former strongman who led the Soviet Union during its glory days. She believes that Putin is playing the long game to put Russia at the world's center stage.
Russia suffers from a tremendous superiority complex because of its size and its history and its potential, and also tremendous inferiority complex precisely because it's never really accepted into being a European country.
Putin's persona as a strong, stern leader, fueled by flamboyant photo ops prior to the pandemic and the brutal crushing of his opponents. Born in St. Petersburg in 1952, Putin was the third son and the only one to survive.
He was from a modest background, and he wasn't particularly a great student, but he was interested in history, and he was very enamored with a lot of KGB-related films.
In the 70s, he turned that fascination into a career, joining the KGB, the Soviet Union's secret police, becoming a mid-level spy. Although the KGB technically ended with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Putin's experience as an intelligence officer and watching the Soviet Union dissolve made its mark.
He was a junior officer stationed in East Germany. He was a keen analyst and observer and would understand how much the Soviet Union needed to reform, how far behind it was falling from the West. And he seems to have carried those attitudes home.
He eventually became the chief of Russia's counterintelligence agency, the FSB. There, he targeted rebels in countries that had separated from the Soviet Union when it dissolved. Putin. His success against Russia's enemies, quickly propelling him to prime minister in 1999. He was elected as acting president the year after and has held onto power ever since. Putin has not been afraid of military conflict in the past, repeatedly launching Russian troops into former Soviet Union territories, Chechnya, Georgia, and most recently, Crimea.
Putin's actions against the Republic of Georgia, Putin's actions attacking Ukraine and annexing Crimea, they were regional acts.
When in 2014, protesters in Kyiv overthrew the pro-Russian Ukrainian president demanding democracy, a violent uprising known as the Revolution of Dignity.
We look at the revolution of 2013-2014 as a popular uprising, right? A good thing. But it also was a coup d'etat. It was protesters occupying the capital, paralyzing the government, and eventually toppling a legitimately elected president. There is a January 6th kind of anger and obsession, not just Putin, but many Russians and many Russians living in eastern Ukraine see the governments that followed as illegitimate.
In response, Putin swiftly invaded, and annex the peninsula on Ukraine's southern front.
Even when he's rattling sabers, he's doing it in a calculated fashion to garner domestic support and get the best possible concessions, the best possible future environment for Russia's security that he possibly can.
To threaten Putin's authority is to risk one's life. Putin accused of silencing his critics through violence, including Alexei Navalny, once called the man Vladimir Putin fears most. He's led anti-Putin rallies across the country, where he's been publicly beaten and nearly blinded when a green substance was sprayed in his face. Navalny continued to be an outspoken critic of Putin until 2 years ago, when he was poisoned, exposed to the deadly nerve agent Novichok, which was developed as part of a secret Soviet chemical weapons program.
Putin's feeling is that you should crush dissent at the earliest possible moment. So he is very sensitive to people who might be rivals. There have been poisonings in the UK. Navalny, when he started to develop his own domestic political persona, gets poisoned. It's a consistent pattern.
Navalny was evacuated to Germany, eventually recovering there, but was arrested on arrival after returning to Russia just over a year ago and still awaits trial in jail.
Navalny's case essentially killed all the opposition because very few demonstrations happen. It's dead. Essentially, opposition is dead.
The absolute ruler now escalating tensions to a boiling point with the West and rolling the dice with this place in history.
Putin's legacy to date is one of strengthening Russia and regaining respect in the world and mostly improving the economy. Were he to launch a major invasion of Ukraine, all of that would be destroyed.
And our thanks to Byron Pitts for that report. Now to someone who has not only studied Vladimir Putin, but he had to deal with the threat of his reign firsthand. Army Colonel Chris Costa served more than 2 decades working in intelligence with Special Operations Forces, advising several U.S. presidents on terrorism, and served as Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council. He's now the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. Chris, always great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Kira. Great to see you.
Well, you know, you and I have been talking a lot since Putin has moved into this invasion phase of things, and just getting your perspective and looking back at your career, knowing how Putin operates. You have studied him. You have worked up strategies to deal with the threat of Vladimir Putin. Take us inside as an intelligence officer for so many decades. To you, who is Putin?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a cumulative effect, right? It is based on the fact that he's an authoritarian leader. He also perceives that he's been humiliated by the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and he is seeking revenge. And as your previous reporting has suggested very well, I might add, is the fact that he was a former KGB officer. That really is his identity. He has cloaked himself in that identity. So what does that mean? We heard some of it in the previous segment. It means he's a fighter, a survivor. He's a tough guy. That's how he perceives himself. He is the man, proverbial man without a face. He tries to be a gray man. Although he has been a principal leader for many, many years, we don't really know who Putin is. And we've seen a slow radicalization, if you will, if I could take some liberty with that word. He is radicalized to the point where he is taking significant greater and greater risks, and that is a problem, wrapped in the fact that he is also an opportunist and he's entrenched in his beliefs. This is a dangerous combination and cumulative effect of years of his essentially running a nation and doing so without the disturbing to me that you now have Putin playing out in such a fashion right now. This is great power competition playing out before our very eyes. You know,
So clearly this conflict is about Putin. It's not about Russia. So why is he picking this particular moment to make this move? Why now?
Yeah, so I've reflected on that. I think there are 4 key points. First and foremost, Afghanistan, the strategic withdrawal, the complete withdrawal out of Afghanistan, it didn't have a good look. It was poorly executed. And there's a perception that the United States is weak. I think that's wrongheaded. We're not weak. We're a great nation. In fact, we will be galvanized by Putin's actions. It might take some time. That's the first point, though, Afghanistan in a perceived weakness. The second point is he may perceive that there's disunity across Europe. Plus, we